Hey Panda Nation, you are listening to the Inverted Gear podcast with your hosts Nelson and Hillary. Join us every week as we take you behind the scenes into our brand, discuss upcoming projects, and conversate beyond the mat with the interesting people we've met along the way.
Hey Steve, how are you?
How you doing, buddy? Happy holidays. Doing well over here.
Happy holidays to you as well. So you are the host of my by far favorite jiu-jitsu podcast.
Even more than your own? Wow.
Even more than my own. Yeah. I like the sound of my voice. So every time I can listen to a podcast without that horrible accent, it's like, oh, this is good stuff.
Yeah, I am the host of BJJ Mental Models, so probably that's the way that most people know me. I'm also, of course, a black belt living up here in Vancouver, BC, Canada. Currently under about 2 feet of snow, which is unusual for the area, but it's fun.
Yeah, as soon as the world goes back to normal and Canada opens up a little bit, we hope to go visit you.
Yeah, it would be fun. I haven't done any jiu-jitsu travel for a while now, so it's going to be, I think there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand. There's a lot of people that I've been meaning to see and meet that I've met virtually or over the last 2 years, yourself included, that I'd love to meet in person. So hopefully we'll get over this thing sooner rather than later.
Yeah. So talk about BJJ Mental Models a little bit and how that got started.
Sure. So BJJ Mental Models is a podcast that is different from a lot of other jiu-jitsu podcasts in that it's an educational podcast. There's not a lot of celebrity interviews or current events talk. Our goal is every episode, we've got something that we want to teach, and we go into a long-form discussion about that concept. And in an ideal world, I bring on a guest who is much smarter than me and much better equipped to talk about that particular concept. So as an example, we recently had Christina Barlon on the podcast to talk about the bow and arrow choke, one of her specialties. And my hope is we can fill that hole in people's training where we can give them concepts and ideas and get the brain going rather than just having more techniques to try to memorize, because I think there's limited utility to trying to fill your head with too many techniques. The podcast started when my brother and I, who we actually don't train together, he has a different instructor than I do, and he's a pro competitor and a gym owner, whereas I'm basically just a hobbyist. But we both came to similar conclusions about jiu-jitsu and the best way, quote unquote, to learn it, and a focus on concepts and idea thinking instead of just memorizing techniques. So we got together, we started putting our ideas together, got them on paper. We started off by putting a database online of all of these ideas, and then the podcast came out, and this was about 3 years ago now as of this recording, and it's kind of just grown and grown and grown since then, and now it's pretty much a full-time job to run that thing, so I have to juggle that in conjunction with my actual full-time job, but it's fun, and I love that aspect of jiu-jitsu, the part that engages the mind, where you're not just thinking about, okay, what are the 12 steps to doing a butterfly sweep? But rather, you're looking for big ideas and patterns and concepts that tie together a lot of different things and helping new people get off the ground and learn this stuff much easier and much more quickly than I did back in the day. So that's kind of the goal. We try to be the top educational podcast out there. We try to fill a niche that no one else has been able to fill, and hopefully we do a good job at it.
Oh, you guys do a great job at it. And I love, especially since we just opened an academy, you had a ton of content about opening an academy and culture and how to set your academy culture from the beginning. And a lot when you had, what's his name, Jamal Easton on, and then like that podcast, if you're an academy owner, I think is a must. So I really thank you for that. I listened to it. I had I asked my wife to listen to it. Our friend Matt, who's helping out at the academy, listened to it. And, we were all just kind of like a checklist. It's like, hey.
That was the one with Elliot Marshall, I think. Is that the one you're talking
Marshall.
about? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Who's under Amal Easton.
Yes.
Yeah, Elliot's, of course, a well-known UFC fighter. I remember back in my white belt days watching him on UFC TV, so it was pretty cool and surreal to be able to talk to him. But one of the things about his story that is quite unique is he really is quite educated and experienced on the business side of things. Whereas I think for a lot of jiu-jitsu people, they come to a point where their competitive career is wrapped up and they realize, okay, I got to actually pay the bills doing this if I want to do it full time. And they put together a gym, but there isn't really a framework for how to do that. There isn't really an educational package for how to create your own gym. And so a lot of people have to kind of stumble their way through it. And what I'd love to see more than anything is more people be able to actually make a decent living in the sport and different ways of doing it. I mean, you don't have to be a competitor. You can be a gym owner. You can be a content creator. And my hope is that we can put together resources that help people figure out how to monetize their jiu-jitsu experience and ultimately feed their families with it. And so conversations like the one we had with Elliot are great because he's built a massively successful franchise of gyms in his area. And so we were able to get a lot of his expertise on building the culture, setting the culture, dealing with challenges. I love conversations like that because they're so applicable, not even just to jiu-jitsu people, but even to people who are otherwise career professionals. A lot of that knowledge is exactly the same if you're working in a workplace. So I found that stuff very, very helpful.
Yes. Also, I really enjoyed lately you had a bunch of sports scientists and you're kind of bridging that gap because for a long time, jiu-jitsu was kind of just isolated and we just did things the way there's always been done, which is like the worst reason to do anything.
Yes. Yeah. This has been something that we've advocated for a lot, which is to bring kind of the scientific aspect of sport into jiu-jitsu to train more intelligently. Jiu-jitsu is, as you know, it is full of people like us who are kind of stubborn and we like to do things our own way and figure it out ourselves. But sometimes it's more productive to find people who specialize in that area. They've done the research and they can give you better techniques. When you look at other sports, often they have a much greater integration with sports psychologists, coaches, coaching science. They take a much more scientific approach. Wrestling is a great example, right? It integrates a lot of science that in jiu-jitsu we don't. Whereas in jiu-jitsu, I mean, I don't know about now, but I remember when I started, there were even people back then, very accomplished people who would say, you don't need to train strength and conditioning or anything, just do more jiu-jitsu. If you want to have good conditioning, just do a whole bunch more jiu-jitsu, which is really bad advice. And back in the day, of course, people's idea of training was basically they would just do like full intensity rounds in the gym nonstop, which of course can rack up injuries, take a toll on your body, shorten your competitive lifespan in the career. So what we do is rather than just getting on more jiu-jitsu people to try to explain things that they don't really kind of understand, we like to also pad that by getting sports psychologists, organizational experts who may or may not even have any jiu-jitsu experience. Some of them are not necessarily grapplers or don't coach grapplers, but a lot of those concepts that you use to teach people peak performance in other sports, it's just as applicable in jiu-jitsu. So it's always fun to get those people on and hear what they have to say.
Yeah, those were really good listens and I really enjoy that. How do you the Vancouver area? I know now there's a plethora of schools available. How has the scene changed since you started?
Oh boy. I mean, I can't speak to the rest of the world, but I can certainly speak to the Vancouver area. When I started in the Vancouver area, jiu-jitsu was just starting to take hold. I mean, I started around the time that the UFC was starting to get popular, and so this thing had gone from just this weird fringe activity to be actually quite popular, and more gyms were cropping up. But at the time, there was kind of a battle of just finding people who were actually experienced enough to teach it. There simply weren't that many black belts in the BC area. You could count them all on one hand. And basically, there were maybe 3 different gyms or 3 different instructors in the BC area who started out and kind of were really well known. And since then, they've produced their own black belts who have then gone off to create their own gyms. And so the interesting thing is if you look in the BC area, the majority of gyms and the majority of black belts you would know about, they all stem from maybe 3 people, which is quite interesting. But that said, though, of course, with people traveling and moving all over the place, and with jiu-jitsu black belts being much more common now than they used to be, that's starting to change. We've got people now who, they have different lineage that they've come up, and they've moved into Vancouver, so the scene is changing and expanding quite a bit. But it was wild because back in the day, you did not have a lot of training choices. You had basically 3 gyms you could choose. Now you can't throw a stick without hitting a jiu-jitsu gym in Vancouver, which is cool. But it's just interesting to see how it has gone from being this thing that was very scarce and kind of rare to being something that is almost everywhere. It's been fun to watch.
Yeah, I mean, in my local area, I was talking to another local black belt, and we're trying to convey to the younger guys, is like, when we started, most academies didn't have a full-time schedule. A lot of the academies were still sharing space, or the instructor had a full-time job. There was a lot of academies that only had classes Monday, Wednesday, Friday, so then you had to go train, drive an hour in a separate direction to go train Tuesday and Thursday if you wanted to train every night. And that was very common in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. Mid-2000s was still very common. Now, most academies have a full-time schedule where there's a 6 a.m. class, there's noon classes, there's night classes. Yeah. So you have these young guys that are training twice a day, every day, as long as they want, So I think that's one of the things you don't take into account when you see how long it takes to get your black belt. Now you have these kids getting their black belts in 6 years. Yeah. It's because they're getting the same amount they're getting more mat time than a black belt used to get in 10 years.
And there's also a quality aspect too. I mean, the reality is that when I started off, I will be the first to admit that my initial training in jiu-jitsu was really quite terrible. I had an instructor who didn't really, I don't even think he really actually cared about teaching. He was just kind of there, just writing it in. He definitely wasn't educated on how to teach effectively. He basically just did the standard thing where he just regurgitated a bunch of techniques and you either got it or you didn't. It was a very inefficient way to learn. And one of the things about jiu-jitsu that I find amusing is we fetishize how long it takes to get the black belt, like as a badge of honor. And I don't quite get that. People will always say, I remember, who was it? Someone, I think it might have been, I can't remember who it was, but we had someone come to our gym and do a seminar, and it was some well-known black belt, and they were basically bragging and being like, jiu-jitsu is the only place to get a real black belt because it takes 12 years. If you want the easy road, go do karate or something. But look, we should not be bragging about the fact that it takes 12 years to get a black belt. All that means is that we're terrible instructors. I don't know why we fetishize and brag about the fact that we're wasting people's time. I think it's great that people right now, if they do this professionally and they're training like a full-time job, they can get a black belt in 3-4 years. I have no issue with that. Because when I trained, like you said, there were 3 gyms that I could choose from, and they had somewhat limited schedules, and you kind of had to take it or leave it. Right? It's not like you could just go shop around. It's not like I could say, oh, well, this gym schedule doesn't really work for me, so I'll find another gym that has classes at the right time. It's like, no, there's 3 choices, and only one of them is within driving distance, and you're either going to take it or you're going to leave it because there's nothing else. So one of the things that I think has been exciting to see is the fact that if you want to do jiu-jitsu professionally, you can do that now. You can go to a gym that runs 3 classes a day, and you can basically devote your full-time job to jiu-jitsu and just train like crazy and get your black belt in 4 years. And I have no issue with that personally. I'm down with that as long as they're good and they learn the equivalent stuff that I did. But I think we should celebrate the fact that we're getting better and that we're able to produce black belts faster now. It would be one thing if these were watered down garbage black belts, but I know most of those people could whoop my ass. So I'm not about to come on here and say they're not real black belts. I am all for efficiency and training people faster and better.
Yeah, I agree. And the beautiful thing about jiu-jitsu is because we're actually sparring, the quality control is kind of baked in.
Yeah.
So you have a black belt that shouldn't be a black belt. Suddenly he goes an open mat with a bunch of other black belts. He gets found out really quickly. Same if he enters a tournament.
Yeah, there's not a lot of no contact point sparring in jiu-jitsu, right? I mean, it is about as full contact as you can get. And if someone is a fraudulent black belt, they will get exposed in about 10 minutes. So I have no concerns whatsoever about that being a problem in our sport. I could see that being a problem in other sports where you can conceal that kind of thing. But in jiu-jitsu, I mean, even if you're not a competitor, if you roll into a gym and you say you're a black belt and you spar with the other black belts, it's going to be clear as day within seconds if that person is actually telling the truth or not. So that's one of the things that I love about jiu-jitsu is that you can't lie on the mats, right? The mats are all about honesty. Whatever happens there, you cannot lie, you cannot conceal. Your true skill and ability is revealed when you train jiu-jitsu.
Oh, man. That's a good clip right there.
You can take it out of context if you want. You can clip it, put it on social.
So what is something that has changed in jiu-jitsu, the way jiu-jitsu is taught to beginners, that you think is for the better?
This is still a change that's happening. It's not, I wouldn't say it's done yet, but I think there's enough people advocating for it that we can talk about it here. When I started jiu-jitsu, most gyms used what I call the traditional 3-part class structure, which means you spend about the first third of the class doing some sort of warm-up. If you're lucky, the warm-up is jiu-jitsu related. If you're unlucky, you're just doing cartwheels and burpees, right? But if you're lucky, maybe it's jiu-jitsu related. You then spend the second half of the class listening to your instructor regurgitate whatever the technique of the day is. So they'll pick some very specific thing like, today we're going to learn how to do this X guard sweep if your opponent puts their hand here and their foot there. And they give you the steps. And then everyone just mindlessly follows those steps and bangs out a few repetitions against a non-resisting training partner. And then the final third of the class is the part that people actually want to do, which is open sparring. So you just go off and you spar, right? Most gyms used that structure when I started, and I think most gyms probably still do use that structure. The problem is there's not really any evidence that that structure is actually good or effective for teaching, right? The problem is, first of all, if you bring people on and you're giving them a warm-up that has nothing to do with jiu-jitsu, you're just wasting their time, right? If someone is a serious jiu-jitsu athlete and they need to do strength and conditioning, they could do that on their own time in their own strength and conditioning class, right? There's really no benefit to having them do a bunch of calisthenics. The reality is if you've got people rolling in your class, they're going to get enough exercise. They're going to burn enough calories for the average person, right? If you're going to do a warm-up, it should be a warm-up that is applicable to jiu-jitsu, and it should have some constraints around it so that the focus is not to burn out your people before you actually even start the class. The focus is to get them moving in a way that's going to be relevant to the class. So my favorite warm-ups usually involve some sort of constraint-based game, like we're going to do some sort of game that involves grip fighting or something like that. But the goal is you're trying to make sure that it doesn't resemble actual sparring too closely, because otherwise people are just going to devolve into sparring. Then they're going to be just going at 100% before the class has even started. So the second part of class that most people have is very commonly you'll go to a class and the instructor, for whatever reason, I don't know why everyone settles on this, but most classes will have 3 techniques of the day. And usually it's going to be some very, very specific thing. Like, here's how you do a scissor sweep if the guy's got one hand here and 2 legs here. And the problem is, there's a good chance that you'll never actually encounter a situation to use that, right? They're very situationally dependent things, and that's not the way real sparring works. When I started jiu-jitsu, I thought that when you were good, when you were a black belt, what that meant is you could basically just do whatever you wanted to the other guy. Like Neo in the Matrix. It's like, if I want to triangle you, I can do it, and you can't stop me because I'm a black belt. I'll just execute the 12 steps to the perfect triangle and no one can stop me. That's a tremendous misconception about how jiu-jitsu actually works. Most of jiu-jitsu is about knowing what you want to do, but also understanding all of the predictable responses that your opponent can realistically do and having an answer to those as well. And so if you just sit down and you just tell your students, okay, here's a triangle, here's the 12 steps to do a triangle, you're actually misleading them in a lot of ways. Because if you try to do a triangle on someone, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to posture up and they're going to start defending. And now that 12-step sequence doesn't work and the person has to move on to something else. So I think that real technique training needs to be more grounded in realistic responses from your opponent, what you should actually expect them to do. And in some cases, if you're good enough at it, how you can coax your opponent into doing things that they don't want to do. That, I think, is a better way to teach. And then when you get into sparring, I mean, look, we all love live sparring. We all, I think, agree that live sparring is the most fun part of doing jiu-jitsu. There's a lot of people I know who would throw out the rest of jiu-jitsu and just do live sparring if they could. But when it becomes time to do live sparring in class, I think it's still good to put a degree of constraints on your class so that you can focus them into working specific things that are important to you. We had some good conversations with, I believe it was Rob Gray on our podcast, and also Doug Limov about this exactly, two professional sports scientists who talked in detail about the ways to structure games and programs so that your students aren't just getting exercise, but they're actually developing a particular skill. If I just go into the gym with you, Nelson, and we just roll for a bunch of time and we don't really have a plan, we're just rolling for fun and to see who can tap whoever, we'll burn some calories and we might have a good time, but there's not a deliberate program to make us better. Whereas what is better is if your instructor identifies, okay, you guys all suck at grip fighting. So I'm going to spend maybe 10 or 15 minutes developing a sequence or a game where we take the jiu-jitsu and we structure the rules such that you have to focus on grip fighting. Because then you can give people a locus, like a focus, so that they can focus on developing particular skills that really matter rather than just going in there and just trying to tap other people. That's a big part of getting people better, is changing the culture so that sparring time is not just about racking up wins in the gym that don't mean anything. Sparring time should actually be about, I've got a specific goal today. I've got a thing I want to focus on getting better at, and I'm going to tailor my sparring so that I actually get better at that thing. So I would say that's kind of where we've come from, where we're at, and where I think we should go, if all of that is sensible. I hope that's clear.
No, that was beautiful. That was very well put. And that I listen to a lot of those podcasts you mentioned, and I listen to your show all the time. So now that we're running the academy, I've been very clear where everybody comes in is like, hey, like you're joining here. This is a gi academy. And in my opinion, this is what's important. And we're going to spend a lot of time over the next few months just working on these very specific things. And I need you to be able to get out of side control. I need you to be able to escape mount. I need you to play close guard efficiently. I need you to be able to work out a half guard. I need you to play butterfly. And we're gonna work on that a ton. And this is how the class is structured. There's gonna be a lot of constraints on sparring. I'm not gonna let you just play lapel guard the entire time you're here and like never develop the close range game that I want you to develop. Because I want everybody to be good in that close range jiu-jitsu, and then we can build out to a medium and then to a long range. But I want everybody to spend time rolling like it's 1996 first, and get really good at hook sweeps and half guard sweeps and duck fight and getting out of side control. And I have a few brown belts that have been training with me for 3 weeks now, and they came from a background where they were doing a lot of no gi, so like their gi was super rusty, and they'd roll with like completely different people now. And it was a lot of constraints-led approach. It was a lot of like sparring runs from side control, which they have never done. They've been training for like 8 years and never started a round from side control. And I just just forcing them to work on these things and forcing them on just building frames, understanding how to build frames and how to attack from there. And then the same thing, like half guard. And then we did a lot of staple passes and smash passes. So you get into like tight jiu-jitsu, like I said, like 1996. And we've been like building out from there. And then eventually we'll get to like more of the fun stuff, but making my students eat their vegetables per se. And the guys that are signed up so far have bought into it, and they're really into it. And it's funny because I'm showing stuff that in my mind is pretty simple and basic and fundamental, but these guys have never been exposed to it before. It's details on the smash pass, details on like the underhook half guard pass that they've never seen. And in my opinion, make a huge difference. So like now suddenly they're like, oh wow, it's like this pass works if I do it, if if I pay attention to these things. And like you said, like the other thing, the way we teach is we show the move, and then we're like, this is what the more sensible ways that you can defend this. So like this is what you should expect, and this is how you funnel somebody into those responses.
Yeah. Something I actually learned from you. There's that awesome article on the Inverted Gear blog that you wrote about funneling, which we completely stole and reappropriated on our own website, because I think funneling is such an important concept in jiu-jitsu, and it's very freeing for most people, especially casual people, to understand that this is a thing, right? I think that there's so much stuff in jiu-jitsu and it evolves so quickly that it can very easily come across as overwhelming, and it can even be demoralizing sometimes, because it feels like no matter how much you learn and no matter how much you train, you're always behind the curve. I know this is a feeling that a lot of jiu-jitsu people feel, which is, man, I just can't learn everything. I could sit there and spend 10 days studying every instructional I can possibly find, but then there's still going to be some other guard or technique or something that I've never heard of, and I just can't get on top of everything. And no matter how good you are, no matter how much time when you put on the mats, it just is not possible to learn everything about this sport. But the thing I love about this concept of funneling, just in terms of how you build your strategy, is you don't need to know everything. You need to know your thing, and you need to know how to make sure that you get back to your thing, right? Your opponent can try to do whatever they want. You don't have to be an expert in their game. If they want to do upside down, Zen Bolo, whatever stuff to you, you don't have to know that stuff. All you have to know is how not to let them do that to you, and then to steer the truck back into the direction that you want to play. So jiu-jitsu in that way is almost like is kind of like a debate sometimes, where the person is trying to they're trying to steer you and make their points, and you're like, no, we're going to go back to my points, and you're trying to steer them back into the thing that you want to do. So it's very freeing when you understand that you're not required to learn everything about jiu-jitsu. Of course, the more you know, the better. That's true. But at the end of the day, we have to accept that none of us can be great at every single aspect of jiu-jitsu, and it's important to know what your strengths are so that you can funnel people into that game and then smash them where you're strongest.
Yeah, every time we demonstrate like any guard pass, one of the things we tell them is like, hey, like, you don't need to play into their guard. If you have a guy that loves knee shield and lives in the knee shield and dreams about knee shield at night, you don't need to pressure into his knee shield and get swept. You can stand back up, like force him to play open guard. Same with the close guard. It's one of the best examples. If you watch Marcelo Garcia, is every time anyone got him in close guard, he just stood up and defended whatever sweep the other guy attempted, opened his guard, then he would force whatever pass he was working on, either a knee cut or he's like underhook half guard pass, and it was over. And it's like so simple, but for whatever reason we want to learn 15 different passes for like 100 different guards that we might encounter, instead of just learning the principle of like, hey, like if you encounter this is how you break these grips, and how you get back to the spot where you can launch this attack.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I remember when I was a white belt, there was this visiting black belt, and he was very ego driven, and he used to brag a lot, and he would brag, and I remember him saying, I know 20 ways to choke you with your own collar. And I remember all of the white belts went, ooh, look at master over here who knows everything. I mean, in the real world, that's useless. You don't need to know all of these fancy things that you're probably never going to use. You just need to know your game, and you need to know how to just keep steering people back into that game. I mean, there's a lot of people in jiu-jitsu who kind of have a game that is very Derek Zoolander-esque, where like they're only good at one thing, but they'll get you into that one thing, and then you can't do anything about it, right? That's a whole concept in the martial arts. In judo, they call that your takui waza, right? Because judo has dozens and dozens and dozens of throws, technically. But most high-level judoka, they're not equally good at all of those throws. And if you were to actually do stats analysis, you wouldn't find that they use all of the throws equally. Most of them have like 2 or 3 banger throws that they're really good at, and they just keep funneling their opponent back into those throws. They're not experimenting around with things that they're not experts in. They're trying to drive people back into their game at a competitive level so that they can always win. They can win and fight in a place where they're the strongest, right? That's really what efficiency in the martial art should be all about. It's not about just trying to throw all of your effort at the other person. It's about forcing them to play in the arena where you're strongest and they're weakest.
Yeah. One of the concepts I talk to my students a lot is when you're developing your game, you have to choose what are you developing it for. If you want to just be a well-rounded grappler, it's one path. If you want to be really good at competition, it's a different path, because that path you just pick in one, two, three things, and you sharpening that axe as much as possible, and like, smaller circles in those techniques. While if you want to be well-rounded, it's going to take longer to get all these different aspects of your game to a world-class level. That's why you see, especially, like gi and no gi happens, is gi guys usually go down the berimbolo route and just get really good at this berimbolo thing, because if you berimbolo in the current rule set, you can sit down, so you don't have to learn takedowns. Yep. You can berimbolo to the back, so you don't have to learn how to pass. And then you only worry about submitting from the back because you're never anywhere else.
Yeah.
And
it's
then,
a very specific funnel.
And then in the other side, if you want to be like a Lucas Lepre or a Marcelo Garcia, that means you have to learn these guards how to sweep. You gotta learn all these different dealing with all these different guards to pass, and then you gotta learn how to finish from the top.
Yeah, the way I describe it with my brother is big into crab riding and berimbolos and stuff. I'm not so much, but he's big into the inverted game. And the thing about the inverted game is it's almost like a teleporter, right? Normally in jiu-jitsu, if I want to get to your back, there's a whole journey I have to go through. Okay, first I got to get you onto the ground, then I got to get on top, then I got to pass your guard. Maybe I even need to go to mount, depending on the sequence I use, but then I got to get to your back, and okay, now finally I can do this thing I want to do. Whereas if you're playing a berimbolo based game or a crab ride based game, you can kind of just teleport. And it's like one second you're in their guard and the next second you're on their back. So it can be very efficient if you're good at it. That said, though, I feel like at this point it's kind of the novelty of the berimbolo is it's not like a new novel thing anymore, so people generally know how to counter it. They're not going to get caught off guard by it like they used to. But there's no question that it works, right? If you are a back taker, it's one of the provided you're good at inverting and spinning around and stuff, it's a very fast way to get onto someone's back. I personally don't do it, but that's mostly because I'm lazy. I like the type of jiu-jitsu where I don't have to move, and going upside down and doing the spinny stuff, it's just, that's too much effort for me.
Yeah, you're trying to stay efficient.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the interesting things about game planning and funneling, right? Is when you define your strategy, you have to know your own goals, because not everyone's strategy is going to be the same, since everyone has different goals and everyone has different attributes. We put together a strategy course on BJJ Mental Models Premium, which is our premium service, and it kind of patterns and explains how to build a game plan from the ground up. And in that course, the first thing we say is, okay, look, if you want to build a strategy, the first thing you need to know is you need to know what are my goals and what are my attributes, because your goals are going to dictate what is a good idea and what is a bad idea for you. And your attributes are going to dictate what kind of techniques and tactics work better for you versus someone else. I've been studying a lot of Claudia Doval recently. I could never play jiu-jitsu the way that she does, right? Like the kind of stuff that she does just due to body type is totally different from me. And it's not that those techniques work better or don't work better than what I do. It's just we have to be honest and admit that everyone's body is different. And for some people, certain things are going to work better than others. But also knowing your goals matters a lot too. I mean, for me, I never shoot double leg takedowns ever. As a rule, I just don't do it. It's not because I don't think they work. I know they work, right? They definitely work. I'm not crazy enough to argue that double leg takedowns don't work. But what I do know is that I don't compete. I'm an older guy. I'm a hobbyist. I just want to have fun. My priority is I don't want to get injured. I especially don't want to get concussed, and I don't want someone to break my neck. So I just don't do double legs, right? Because since I'm not competing, I'm always fighting an open weight in the gym. It's very likely I'm going to be going in there with someone who's got 100 pounds on me. I don't want to shoot a double and get clocked in the face. I don't want to shoot a double and have some giant beefy behemoth just sprawl on my neck. So I just don't do doubles. It's not that they don't work, but it's that given my goals, it's just not a technique I would ever use. So I always try to use techniques where I don't have to rush headfirst into my opponent because I don't want to get a concussion. But if I were in my 20s and I was a serious competitive athlete and I primarily did no-gi and I was trying to do a run up to take Worlds or go to Abu Dhabi, then absolutely I would do doubles, right? Because it's a risk reward thing, right? If my goal is so lofty, like I want to be a world champion, I'm going to care about techniques that work. And the long-term impact on my body is a lesser concern than whether I can win the gold medal this year, right? So it's different for everybody. And that's a big part about goal setting that we don't talk about, is understanding that the goals you have dictate what kind of strategies are going to make sense for you.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And this is a great time of the year to talk about goal setting.
Yeah. Well, everyone's doing that now, right? It's New Year's resolution time for sure.
Yeah, we shot a quick video this morning talking about smart goal setting and being process-oriented versus goal-oriented.
Yeah.
Not goal-oriented.
Result-oriented.
Result-oriented, there we go.
Yeah.
So I shared a story of when I was a purple belt, my goal for the year, 3 years in a row, one of my goals was win the New York Open. And I just put this giant monkey on my back, because my year, like my progress on the year depended on me winning this tournament that at the time was one of the tougher tournaments in the country, because New York Open was the first Open. So the first year they had it, that was it. That was the only Open that was outside the pans and the Worlds in the country. So a lot of people would travel for the New York Open. And I remember I lost first round the first year and by an advantage. And then the next year I lost in the semis. And then the third year I finally won it. And I just remember getting the monkey off my back. And I have put so much pressure on myself for 3 years over this stupid medal. Mm-hmm. And I was just so happy that I won it. And then a second later I was like,
now what?
That was so stupid that I put myself under so much pressure. But at the same time, if I'm looking back, because I gave myself that goal, I stayed in my weight class. I was eating clean. I was drilling, and I was doing all the things I needed to improve my jiu-jitsu to get it to the level where I could win the tournament. But if I could travel back in time, I would just be more process oriented and just tell myself, okay, you need to train this many times a week. These are the things that will get you to where you want to be, instead of just putting all this pressure into winning this one tournament.
Yeah. I love this conversation about focusing on the process instead of focusing on the outcomes. We did a whole conversation with Brian Glick from the Danaher team about this specifically. This is something that I hear a lot of, especially white belts, whenever I'm asking people, okay, what are your goals in jiu-jitsu? They'll always have something very specific and targeted, like I want to be world champion, or I want to get black belt, or something like that. But a goal like that is a very lofty goal. And if you're only thinking about the goal and that's your laser focus, then first of all, it's easy to get demoralized, because a lot of these goals they take a long time, right? If you want to get a black belt, again, we talked about this earlier, but under the current system, there's a good chance you're looking at a decade-long run to get that. And it's very easy to lose your motivation if your goal is going to take that long. Similarly, if you have a competitive goal, the problem is that you can't always control all variables in a competition environment, right? You could do everything right and then, run up to the competition, and then you step onto the mat, and then you slip and fall on your face and get a concussion, and now you're out, right? That weird things like that can happen. So factors outside of your control can prevent you from succeeding. So the problem is, if your ego and your sense of identity are completely married to whatever that goal is, to the point where you feel like you're worth less if you don't succeed, you're just setting yourself up for a path of misery. So that's why people always say, trust the process, right? Build habits and put the habits before the results. Yes, you need to have a goal. You should always have a goal, because that kind of helps you define what your process is going to look like. So it's okay to say, I want to be a world champion, but rather than obsessing about becoming a world champion, it's better to figure out, to reverse engineer, okay, what are the habits and the processes of a world champion, and to execute those processes. And every day, try to execute those and be just a little bit better. That's a much healthier mindset than trying to obsess over some future thing that may or may not ever happen. You see this a lot with high-level athletes, where when they're winning, they look unstoppable. But as soon as they lose or they fail, they just have a mental collapse, right? It's hard to be mentally resilient in the face of failure like that. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to focus on process and habits and building good habits. So that's what I always tell people. If they want, look, if you want a black belt, your obsession should not be, I want a black belt. Your obsession should be train consistently, intelligently, and safely. That's really it. Just try to make the most of every single training session. Focus on it day by day, day at a time. Get better a little bit every single day. You'll get there eventually.
Yeah, that's great advice. And one of the things I think doesn't get spoken about enough is one of the major, in my opinion, I have no data on this, but I have observed over the years is major injuries are one of the separators. That's one of the spots where we just lose people.
Yep.
And if you get to black belt, most likely you made it less than one surgery in. There's some black belts like I know that like 6 knee surgeries in or whatever. But for your average jiu-jitsu practitioner, that's the spot when their wife is like, hey man, you're 40, you have 2 kids, this is your second knee surgery, is this really worth it? And that's the spot where we start losing people. And one of the things like now that we're running the academy, I think a lot is, especially when I get these older guys with injuries, not very flexible, and they want to start training jiu-jitsu, is I don't let them spar right away. I don't let anyone spar right away, but especially if I can see a bunch of like flexibility issues where you can't sit in seiza because your hips and knees are so tight, I know somebody's going to shove you there and something's going to give because your body can't get there passively. So one of my students right now he's in his 40s and he's just been coming in early, and like I was like, hey, like this is your homework. And he has like athletic background, and he's been working on squat, like getting his squat depth down and being able to sit his butt to his heels in seiza. And we're like 3 weeks in and he's almost there. But I can see how anywhere else he could have been like, oh yeah, like start sparring, and then that's when knees goes, or like something goes in the hip, or something goes in the ankle.
Yeah. I'm very passionate about this topic. I know that our mutual friend, Matt Kirtley, has talked about this as well. He's told me that he has a lot of jiu-jitsu regrets because when he started, he had an instructor who was like, go, 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 kill, 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 crush, crush, crush. And he said, he got a lot of injuries at white belt that he really regretted getting because he was trying to train harder instead of smarter. And I think that's a cardinal sin that we make in jiu-jitsu. One of the traditions in jiu-jitsu is when you get new people, you throw them into the shark tank and just let them get tapped 100 times, right? Because that's the way that we look at the sales pitch of jiu-jitsu. The thing about jiu-jitsu is it works, right? A lot of martial arts, you can't do that safely, right? But in jiu-jitsu, look, I can throw you into the snake pit with a bunch of blue belts and purple belts, and you're going to get obliterated. And within 30 seconds, there's going to be no doubt in your mind that this thing works, right? This is a legitimate martial art. So most gyms do that. That's part of their onboarding plan, is they take the new guy and they just throw them in there and let them get tapped 800 times. And they will realize this thing is legitimate, and then they will want to train it. That's the thought. It's also a terrible idea because you're queuing up so many injuries because you're telling people fight first, learn later. That's a really stupid idea, right? In a combat sport, you should learn first and then fight later. You should never fight first before you know what you're doing. An example that I could think of is like, imagine a boxing gym. Imagine someone who walks into a boxing gym and says, hey, I don't know anything about boxing. I always wanted to do it. I'm starting. I don't know how to throw a punch. I don't know how to protect myself. I don't know anything. I don't know what a hook is. I don't know what an uppercut is. Teach me, master. First thing that they're going to do is they're going to teach you defensive posture, right? They're going to say, okay, keep your hands up, keep your chin down. They're going to help you work on your footwork. They're going to help you work the mat or the mitts, right? They're going to get you familiar with how to protect yourself first and foremost. And then at some point, you might start actually doing a degree of sparring later. That's not what we do in jiu-jitsu. In jiu-jitsu, we just tell people, go in there. Here's Jose. He's another white belt. You guys go in there and just fight to the death, right? In a lot of gyms, the only thing they teach you before they put you in sparring, I remember when I started, they taught me one thing before they put me into live sparring, and that was, this means I give up. And it's going to happen. So just get ready to do that. They didn't teach me how to defend myself or anything. And that's why I think you get so many white belts who have stupid injuries, is because they were never taught defensive posture and defensive structure. They don't understand that leaving your arms and legs dangling all over the place and leaving your head dangling is a bad idea, and you're probably going to get injured, right? They don't know where injuries come from because we don't teach them. Whereas I think that if we were smart, the first thing we would do when we teach new people is we would teach them like a boxing coach would, which is we need in jiu-jitsu the equivalent of chin down, hands up. Just by default in jiu-jitsu, you should not leave your neck dangling. You should keep your elbows pinched in. Don't let them grab your legs, especially not the knees, because if they can grab your knee, they can control the whole damn thing. That's should be the focus, is keeping a defensive posture. And you should only put people into sparring once you are relatively confident that they're not going to do something dumb to get themselves injured. Because we have to understand, when someone comes to our gym and they want to learn jiu-jitsu, they're entrusting us with their bodies. And depending on who they are, that might also mean they're entrusting us with their livelihood. Right? If your job requires physical health, if you have to lift heavy things, if you have to use your hands, if it requires any degree of physicality, when someone walks into the jiu-jitsu gym, they're entrusting the instructor with their livelihood and their career, right? If they get a bad injury, that could prevent them from working, and now their family can't eat. This is not a joke, right? For most people, pajama wrestling is a hobby, and we need to take care of those people, and we don't do a very good job of that. So I agree with you that the first thing we do before we throw people into the death pit should be we teach them how to protect themselves. That's actually why I like Preet Mikkelson's stuff. I don't necessarily agree with everything he does. His stuff is very specific. I think it fills a hole. I think there's some interesting stuff there, but it's not all of jiu-jitsu. It's a very specific thing. But the one thing he does do right out of the gate is he teaches white belts how not to get injured. And going back in time, I would have loved to have a framework like that. Like, I would have loved to have spent the first 3 months of jiu-jitsu just learning, here's how not to get injured in the face of a crazy aggressive person. That would have been so much better than the way I was taught.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking this morning. Do you remember Solo's book, University of Jiu-Jitsu?
I know exactly where you're going with this. Yep.
Yeah,
yep.
And then like the way that book was designed was, first chapter was surviving. So it was survive, escape, control, submit. So
no, you missed one. It was survive, escape, sweep, control, and then submit.
Oh, there we go. There was a missing one. Thank you.
5. See, I know this because I remember this because he tied it to each of the 5 belts, right? He says,
yeah. So I was trying to think this morning. I was like, wait, am I missing one? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but you starting with surviving, because white belts always ask you, it's like, what should I be working on? Or like blue belts, it's like, hey, I'm a white belt. What should I be working on? And like the short answer is everything,
Yep.
But more than anything is like, hey, like, when you're in a bad spot, are you getting tapped?
Yeah.
And then can you work out of a bad spot? That's escaping part. And then once you get out of that, can you get on top? When you get on top, can you hold somebody down? And that's one of the parts it's been interesting to teach, because I put a lot of emphasis on pinning when we're controlling, and weight distribution, and this is what you need to be looking for, like, just the principles of just holding somebody down. Because I came from a wrestling background, and I did a lot of judo coming up at the same time I was doing jiu-jitsu. So like pinning and turnovers were like a big part of my curriculum coming up. So Amazon guys like knocking on my window showing me a box. So pinning being part of the curriculum and actually controlling people, and not just the pass, but this is how you hold somebody down if they're trying to escape.
Yeah.
Which is like super underrated until you roll with like somebody who's like 6'3", 285 and doesn't want to be in the bottom. You're like, oh,
now I get it.
This matters.
Yeah, that framework that Salo put together, it's been a long time since I've read that book, so I can't say off the top of my head if the specific techniques still hold up over time. But that concept of the hierarchy, it's like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs of jiu-jitsu, where he kind of like organizes your priorities. I think that is, to this day, still so important. It's funny, we just had Sanjay Hibero on the podcast, and although I haven't launched it yet, and we specifically talked about this because, of course, it's a Hibero book. But this idea of survival is your foundation. Man, we forget that when we train, right? So many instructors came from a competition background, and so they train all of their students like their goal is to be a pro competitor. But for 95% of your students, that's not going to be their goal, right? Most of us got into this sport because we believed in the promise from the UFC that this thing can protect you when you need to be protected. And the win conditions of a real fight are very different from the win conditions of jiu-jitsu, right? In the real world, like put aside the jiu-jitsu crap, right? In the real world, if you jump me in a dark alley, Nelson, I don't care if I'm able to sweep you and triangle you from mount. It makes no difference to me. The only thing I care about is survival and not getting hurt, right? I simply do not care if I'm able to actually tap you. I want to protect myself. If all that jiu-jitsu does is teach me to keep myself safe in the face of an aggressor until the cops come or someone intervenes, that's still a win as far as I'm concerned, right? And that's the thing I like about that jiu-jitsu university structure is it teaches you the first thing you need to do is get survival in place. I get emails from white belts all the time who are beating themselves up. And they're saying things like, I've been training for, I literally just responded to an email like this yesterday. I've been training for 8 months. I'm a white belt. I've never got a submission. I feel like I'm terrible at this. And my answer is, look, you're measuring with the wrong stick here, right? If you're a white belt, you getting submissions is basically irrelevant because frankly, you probably don't even know how to do those submissions anyway. If you manage to get a submission on someone, it's probably because they sucked and your submission wasn't very good, but they just were so bad and their defense was so bad that you managed to catch them. And maybe you relied on your athleticism to do that. That should not be your goal, a white belt. At a white belt, your goal should be surviving. Your goal should be reducing the spread, right? Increasing the amount of time between the other guy tapping you out. You shouldn't even necessarily be worried about whether they're passing your guard that much. That comes later because you are going to get your guard passed when you're a white belt. Your goal should be learning to survive. What you want to do is go in there with a blue belt and they're going to tap you in 30 seconds. And then next month, you want to increase that spread to 2 minutes and then 3 minutes. And you want to get to the point where that blue belt cannot reliably tap you anymore. That should be your foundational framework for jiu-jitsu. And then once you get that in place, then you can start worrying about, okay, how do I hold this guy in my guard? Then you can go to how do I sweep him? How do I control? But I think people sometimes get their priorities mixed up and they forget this is a self-defense art and most people take it for self-defense. And if you get jumped on the street by a mugger, they're not going to care what the points are at the end of the 5-minute round, right? Like that is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is your safety. And that should always be your focus and the foundation of everything we do in jiu-jitsu. If you're training your students in a way where they're not safe and they're getting injured and they don't know how to protect themselves, I think you've kind of missed the boat on what jiu-jitsu is actually all about. Might be a controversial opinion, but I really believe that jiu-jitsu is about defending yourself and survival first and foremost before anything else.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think one of the issues, you mentioned Preet. I think Preet and by extension, like the Hiberos, like the book we talked about, are one of like the few instructors that actually verbalize survivability because a lot of instructors, like you always talk about in the podcast, which is great competitors that started training when they were 12. So there's a lot of habits and postures that they have that they don't even aware that they do. So they never taught to verbalize, say, hey, when you're in side control, this is where your arms should be so you don't get submitted. When you're in this bad spot, this is how you tuck your neck and look to the left in order to slip the choke. So I really appreciate Preet for just going so deep down this rabbit hole and, like, you know, finding his little postures that he works on and how to, you know, he's taking a look at, like, hey, like you know, we're doing the turtle wrong. If we're doing the turtle this way, it would be more effective. And going down that rabbit hole is fascinating. And in my opinion, like I came from like the sports background, so most of my time sparring, or if we ever did specific games, was, hey, this is open guard. Don't let somebody pass you. It's like, so it's like sweeper submit, and then guy on top is passer submit. And there were like constraints like don't fall back for leg locks, stuff like that. Or we were starting from half guard, like, you know, if you get back to close guard, the bottom guy wins, and, like, you know, so the passer never as a passer, you don't let people put you back in half guard. But now I'm older. I'm like, hey, like, there's a lot of benefit to the defensive stuff. And then for a long time, I saw it as, it's like, why would it work on losing slower? And now that I'm older and slower, and like, I have these like professional athletes trying to kill me because like, I don't train all the time anymore, but I have students that do. I'm like, okay, like this stuff really, like, also like last few years, I've been training a lot with like the 10 Planet with the local 10 Planet academies. And those guys are just firing submissions from everywhere all the time. And they don't care if they're in a bad spot. They're still like firing submissions from there. Like they're doing like boogie chokes and like, all kinds of, and like launching leg locks from everywhere. So just surviving rounds like really became a thing for a while, because if in jiu-jitsu, especially if you're comfortable with if you're like a really good open guard player and you can keep most people from passing your guard, and suddenly you find yourself in a spot where you might go a month without having somebody in side control.
Yep.
And now it's like, oh, this is the thing.
Yeah, that's the funny thing, right? As you get more experienced, you're less likely to be put in really bad positions unless you're sparring with people who are better than you. But the pool of people who are better than you gets much smaller as you get more experienced. So your defense can actually atrophy because you're just not used to people getting on your back anymore, right? I had this problem where when I got to brown belt, I realized that my back defense was terrible and the reason why was because against a regular opponent, and being a brown belt, I'm one of the more senior people in my gym. So if I pick a random partner, odds are I'm more experienced with them. So odds are I'm going to be the one on the attack the whole time, right? So I'm simply not getting in any defensive repetitions because I'm always training my attack, because the other person, by virtue of being less experienced, just has no chance against me, right? But the problem that was happening was when I went against someone who was good, they would just get onto my back and tap me right away. And it was because my defense had atrophied because I wasn't specifically training it. And that's kind of when I realized the importance of targeted training. Because if you just train organically, where you're just basically rolling all the time without any structure, you're going to just naturally gravitate towards the things that you're good at, and you're going to avoid the things that you're not, and you're going to, who your partners are is going to dictate whether you're training your offense or your defense. So there's a lot of variables to control. So if you want to be good and well-rounded and not have giant gaping holes, that's where the targeted training comes into play, right? So it's an important thing to understand, because if you're the only black belt in the room and you're just schooling everybody in the gym, you have to put yourself in bad situations just so that you can get the reps, if nothing else, right? Otherwise, your defense is going to atrophy, and you definitely don't want that.
For sure. All right, Steve, I think that's a good closing point. Thank you so much for your time. Where can people find you online?
Thanks a lot, Nelson. Always fun to chat. Of course, if people want to check me out, probably the best place to start with is the BJJ Mental Models podcast. So on basically any podcast app you can think of. So if you just go into whatever you use to listen to podcasts, just search for BJJ Mental Models and you'll find it. It's also on YouTube if you want to search there. And failing all of that, you can just go to our website, bjjmentalmodels.com, which links off to the podcast and everything else that we make. So that's where I would recommend people check us out. There's a ton of free stuff on there, hundreds of episodes at this point. So if you want to listen to me prattle on about jiu-jitsu for hundreds of hours, that's where you would go to do it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nelson. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening, Panda Nation. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Inverted Gear podcast. You can find us at invertedgear.com as well as your favorite podcast app. Don't forget to give us a like, and we'll see you soon.